In the oldest book ever written by human hands, there is a passage that has haunted scholars, theologians, and researchers for thousands of years. It appears in Genesis, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and it says something extraordinary, that before the great flood, before Noah built his ark, before God decided to reset the world, there were giants on the earth, not metaphorical giants, not giants of spirit or achievement, actual physical giants, beings of immense size and power, who walked among ordinary humans, who built civilizations, who left traces in the earth that archaeologists are still finding today. The Bible calls them the Nephilim, and tonight we are going to discover that they were far more real, far more fascinating, and far more disturbing than anything you have ever been told. Breathe deeply, relax, and come with me to the oldest mystery in human history. Close your eyes. Imagine you are standing in a museum, an enormous museum with corridors that stretch further than the eye can see. In this museum, there are bones, enormous bones, human in shape, but completely inhuman in scale, femurs as tall as a grown man, skulls large enough to hold a child, rib cages wider than a doorway. These bones were found in excavations around the world, in the deserts of the Middle East, in the mountains of Peru, in the plains of North America, in the caves of Europe. They were cataloged, photographed, studied by scientists who could not explain what they were looking at, and then many of them disappeared, removed from museums, withdrawn from academic records, quietly buried again in places where no one would find them. Why would anyone hide evidence of the existence of giants? That question is at the heart of one of the greatest mysteries in human history. And tonight, we are going to explore it together, calmly, in detail, with all the time in the world. Because the story of the giants is not just a religious story. It is a story about what we know, what we have been allowed to know, and what someone has decided we should not know. Relax completely. Let the tension leave your body. Let your breathing become slow and deep. There is no rush tonight. There is only silence, the weight of ancient history, and the echo of beings who walked this earth long before us. To understand the giants of the Bible, we must first go back to the very beginning, to the book of Genesis, to the oldest written account of human history that we possess. Genesis chapter 6 tells us something that most Sunday school classes skip over remarkably quickly. It says that the sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim in the original Hebrew, came down to earth and took human women as wives, and from those unions were born the Nephilim. The word Nephilim in Hebrew is fascinating in itself. It comes from the root nephal, which means to fall, the fallen ones, the ones who came down. And the text describes them as mighty men of old, men of renown. But the description of their physical size appears more specifically in another book of the Bible, the book of Numbers, chapter 13. When Moses sent 12 spies into the land of Canaan, they came back with a terrifying report. They said that the land was inhabited by giants, and that next to these giants, they felt like grasshoppers. Grasshoppers. Think about what that description implies. If an average adult human feels like a grasshopper next to these beings, we are talking about creatures of extraordinary size, 8 feet tall at minimum, perhaps 10 feet, perhaps more. But the giants in the Bible are not limited to the Nephilim of Genesis. Throughout the Old Testament, there are references to multiple races of giant beings, the Anakim, described as descendants of the Nephilim, inhabiting the land of Canaan before the Israelites arrived, so terrifying that trained soldiers who had witnessed miracles in Egypt were paralyzed with fear at the sight of them. The Rephaim, another race of giants, who had their own kingdoms east of the Jordan River. Their king, Og of Bashan, is described in Deuteronomy as having a bed made of iron that was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. 9 cubits is approximately 13.5 feet. 4 cubits is approximately 6 feet. That is a bed 13.5 feet long for a king who needed a bed that size. The Emim, the Zamzumim, the Avim, race after race of giant beings, mentioned throughout the Old Testament as if their existence were completely normal and completely real. And then there is the most famous giant of all, Goliath of Gath. 1 Samuel chapter 17 describes him as standing 6 cubits and a span tall. 6 cubits is approximately 9 feet. 6 cubits and a span is closer to 9.5 feet. His armor alone weighed more than 125 pounds. His spearhead weighed 15 pounds. His coat of mail was made of bronze and weighed 5,000 shekels. This was not a metaphor. This was a description of a physical being who faced a young shepherd named David on a battlefield in the valley of Elah. A being so terrifying that the entire army of Israel, seasoned warriors who had fought battles across the desert, refused to face him. For 40 days he came out and issued his challenge. For 40 days no one answered him, until a teenage boy with a sling and 5 smooth stones walked out to meet him. But Goliath was not the only giant of Gath. 2 Samuel chapter 21 describes 4 giants of Gath who fought against David's warriors. One of them had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a total of 24 digits. Polydactyly, the condition of having extra fingers or toes, is a real genetic condition that exists in human populations today, but its prevalence among these giants of Gath suggests something interesting about their genetics, about what made them different from ordinary human beings. Almost every major civilization in human history has its own tradition of giant beings. The ancient Greeks wrote about the Titans, beings of immense size who preceded the gods of Olympus, who built mountains and shaped the earth itself. Their war against the gods of Olympus, the Titanomachy, shook the foundations of the universe for 10 years before the Titans were defeated and imprisoned beneath the earth. The ancient Sumerians, whose civilization is considered one of the oldest on earth, wrote about the Anunnaki, beings who came from the sky, who created humanity to serve them, who were described as being of extraordinary size and power. The Sumerian king lists describe rulers who reigned for thousands of years, with lifespans that would be impossible for ordinary humans. The ancient Egyptians had their own traditions of giant beings who walked the earth before the time of the pharaohs. The Zep-Tepi, the first time, a mythological era when gods and giants ruled Egypt directly before handing power to human kings. The Norse mythology speaks of the Jotnar, the frost giants and fire giants who inhabited the world before humanity, who were so large that their bodies became the mountains and oceans of the earth when they died, whose blood became the rivers, whose bones became the rocks. The indigenous peoples of North America have traditions of giant beings who inhabited the continent before the arrival of ordinary human beings. The Paiute tribe of Nevada describes a race of red-haired cannibalistic giants called the Site-Ka, who they warred with for generations, and who were eventually driven into a cave, which was then sealed and burned to destroy them. That cave, Lovelock Cave in Nevada, was excavated by archaeologists in 1912. They found red-haired mummies, duck decoys, and bones that some researchers claim belong to individuals significantly larger than ordinary humans. The indigenous peoples of South America describe giant beings who built the megalithic structures of the Andes. Structures whose stones are so large and so precisely fitted that modern engineers struggle to explain how ordinary humans could have built them. Every culture, every continent, every era of human history, giants. Why would every civilization on Earth independently invent the same story? That question does not have an easy answer. But the consistency of the accounts across cultures that had no contact with each other, across oceans and centuries and languages, suggests that these stories are not just myths. They are memories. Memories of something real that happened to the human race, something that left such a profound impression that it was recorded in every culture's most sacred and most enduring texts. Now we arrive at perhaps the most controversial and most fascinating aspect of the giant story, the physical evidence. Because the giants of the Bible and of ancient tradition are not just literary characters. They left traces in the physical world, traces that archaeologists have been finding and studying for more than a century, and in some cases, traces that have mysteriously disappeared. The first category of evidence is the skeletal remains. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, American newspapers published dozens of reports of giant human skeletons being discovered during excavations and agricultural work across North America. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, respected publications of their era, not tabloids, not sensationalist papers. They reported consistently on discoveries of skeletal remains that were far larger than anything that should exist according to mainstream science. Reports described skeletons ranging from 7 to 12 feet in height, with double rows of teeth, with skulls of unusual shape and size, with bone density far exceeding that of ordinary humans. The Smithsonian Institution, America's national museum and the largest museum complex in the world, received reports of, and in some cases, actually collected these remains. And then they disappeared. In 2014, a satirical website published a fake story claiming that the Supreme Court had ordered the Smithsonian to release documents admitting it had destroyed thousands of giant human skeletons to protect the official narrative of human evolution. The story was fake, but the reaction to it was extraordinary. Millions of people shared it immediately, not because they could not tell the difference between satire and news, but because it confirmed something they already suspected, that evidence of giant humans exists, that it has been found, and that someone has been systematically making it disappear. The second category of evidence is architectural. Around the world, there are ancient structures built with stones so massive, so precisely cut, and so perfectly fitted together that mainstream archaeology has no completely satisfying explanation for how ordinary human beings built them. The megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, built with stones weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together without mortar with such precision that a piece of paper cannot be inserted between them. The temples of Baalbek in Lebanon, with foundation stones weighing over 1,000 tons each, the largest stones ever used in any construction in human history. Stones so large that the most powerful cranes in the world today would struggle to lift them, and no one knows who built them or how. Were these structures built by ordinary humans? Mainstream archaeology says yes, using ramps and ropes and incredible organization. But some researchers ask a different question. What if some of these structures were built by beings for whom moving 100-ton stones was simply not a problem because they were large enough to do it? The third category of evidence connects directly to genetics. Modern genetic research has revealed something extraordinary about human DNA. We carry within our genome traces of ancient interbreeding with species that are not fully human. Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA, and traces of what geneticists call ghost populations. Ancient human-like species that interbred with our ancestors and left their mark in our genes, but whose bones have never been found. Ghost populations, beings whose genetic material is in us, but whose physical existence has left no trace that we have been able to find. Could these ghost populations be related to the Nephilim? To the giant beings described in the Bible and in the traditions of every culture on Earth? It is a question that serious geneticists are beginning to ask in quiet corners of their research. But before we explore why the evidence has been hidden, there is one more layer to this story that deserves to be told. The Book of Enoch. Most people have never heard of the Book of Enoch. It is not part of the standard Bible used by most Christian denominations today, but it was considered sacred scripture by the earliest Christians. It is quoted directly in the New Testament. It was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest biblical manuscripts ever discovered, hidden in caves near the Dead Sea for 2,000 years. And it tells the story of the Nephilim in extraordinary detail. The Book of Enoch names the leaders of the sons of God who came to earth. It calls them the Watchers. 200 of them descended on a mountain called Hermon, and there they made an agreement, a pact, to take human wives and have children with them. Their leader was named Semyaza, and the text records their names one by one, 200 names, of beings who left their proper domain and chose to cross a line that was not meant to be crossed. The Book of Enoch describes what the Watchers taught humanity. They shared knowledge that humans were not meant to have yet, the secrets of metalworking, of weapons making, of cosmetics and the art of seduction, of astrology and the reading of the stars, of medicine and the properties of plants. They accelerated human civilization, but they also corrupted it. Their giant offspring consumed everything. When human food was not enough for them, they turned to animals. When animals were not enough, they turned to humans. They brought violence and chaos into the world that God had intended for peace. And God responded. He sent 4 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. He instructed them to bind the Watchers in the earth until the day of judgment, to destroy their giant offspring in a great war, and to cleanse the earth with a flood, the flood of Noah. According to the Book of Enoch, the Great Flood was not just about human wickedness. It was specifically about the Nephilim, about the contamination that the Watchers had introduced into the world. The flood was meant to destroy the offspring of the Watchers, to remove their corrupted bloodlines from the earth entirely. But it did not work completely, because the giants returned after the flood. The Bible itself tells us this. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. They came back. How? If the flood was meant to destroy them, how did they return? That question has occupied theologians and researchers for centuries without a definitive answer. Some suggest that not all of the Watchers were bound, that some escaped and continued their activities after the flood. Others suggest that the corrupted genetic material was already too deeply integrated into the human population to be completely eliminated, that even survivors of the flood carried traces of the Nephilim bloodlines. And others suggest something even more extraordinary, that the return of the giants after the flood was not an accident, that it was planned, that the Watchers, even bound beneath the earth, retained enough influence to ensure that their bloodlines would survive and eventually re-emerge. And now we arrive at the question that haunts this entire investigation. Why would anyone hide evidence of giants? The answer depends on who you believe has been hiding it. The first theory is the religious one. If giants existed as described in the Bible, if they were literally the offspring of divine beings and human women, then the implications for our understanding of religion are extraordinary. It would mean that the Bible's account of history is not just metaphorical, that the sons of God who came down to earth were real beings, that the supernatural events described in the Old Testament actually happened. What were the sons of God? Angels? Beings from another world? Something else entirely that does not fit into any of our existing categories? The second theory is the evolutionary one. Modern science has built a very specific narrative about human evolution. In that narrative, Homo sapiens evolved gradually from earlier hominid species over millions of years. We are the pinnacle of a long and slow process of natural selection. The existence of a race of giant humans, who were the offspring of supernatural beings and ordinary women, shatters that narrative completely. And the institutions that have spent a century and a half building that narrative might have very powerful reasons to make inconvenient evidence disappear. The third theory is the most disturbing of all. What if the giants did not disappear? What if they simply changed? Some researchers propose that the Nephilim interbred with ordinary humans over generations, that their bloodlines diluted but never disappeared completely, that certain families, over thousands of years, retained more of that original Nephilim heritage than others, and used that advantage to accumulate power, to build empires, to control economies, to shape history from the shadows. Is it a coincidence that the ancient traditions of royalty consistently described rulers as being of divine descent, as having a different nature from ordinary humans? Perhaps, or perhaps, the story of the Nephilim is not just a story from the past. Perhaps it is a story that is still being written. And so, as the ancient bones rest in their hidden places, and as the texts of every civilization on earth speak of beings who were not quite human, you can rest tonight. Let your mind relax. Let your thoughts settle like dust in an ancient tomb. There is something profoundly humbling about the possibility that we are not the first, that before us, walking on this same earth, there were others, beings of extraordinary power, who built things we cannot build, who knew things we have forgotten, who left traces in the earth and in our genes and in the stories we tell our children before they go to sleep. Perhaps that is why these stories have survived for thousands of years, not just as religious texts or cultural myths, but as memories, as something deep in the human mind that recognizes, even when it cannot prove, that the world is older and stranger and more extraordinary than we have been told. Tonight, let that ancient memory accompany you as you sleep. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and dream of a world before the world we know. Good night.